It's 2000 BC. You're in Mesopotamia, somewhere between what is now Iraq and Syria. The city is Nippur. A man has stopped eating. He stopped sleeping 3 weeks ago. He sits in the corner of his house and stares at the wall, and nobody in his family knows what to do. A priest arrives, not to pray, to diagnose. He examines the man's eyes. He asks about his dreams. He checks his pulse. He consults a clay tablet, a reference document listing symptoms alongside their causes and treatments. This isn't a religious ceremony. This is medicine. And that tablet, the Diagnostic Handbook of Psychiatric, written around 1067 BC, is the oldest known psychiatric manual in human history, and it describes something we would recognize immediately, what we now call depression. Here's the thing. Nobody tells you when they talk about mental illness. The epidemic narrative, the idea that anxiety and depression and psychological suffering are somehow a modern invention, products of screens and social media and the particular anxieties of the 21st century, that narrative is wrong. Catastrophically, demonstrably, historically wrong. Mental illness is not a modern disease. It is one of the oldest documented aspects of the human experience. What changed isn't the suffering. What changed is what we called it, and what we did about it. And those changes, across 5,000 years of human history, tell a story that should make you profoundly uncomfortable about where we are right now. Because here's what the history of mental illness actually looks like when you trace it from the beginning. Every civilization that has ever existed has had people whose minds broke in predictable, recognizable patterns. People who couldn't get out of bed for months. People who heard voices that weren't there. People who were paralyzed by fear of things that posed no real threat. People whose thoughts raced so fast they couldn't sleep and couldn't stop and eventually couldn't function. In Mesopotamia, they called it the hand of a ghost. In medieval Europe, they called it demonic possession. In 18th century England, they called it melancholia. In 1950s, America, they called it a nervous breakdown. In 2024, we call it major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar 1, ADHD. The suffering is the same. The diagnosis is a product of its era. Let's go back to that clay tablet. The Diagnostic Handbook isn't just historically interesting. It's psychologically sophisticated in ways that should genuinely surprise you. It categorizes symptoms. It distinguishes between different types of psychological disturbance. It describes behavioral patterns, withdrawal, loss of appetite, inability to function, and links them to specific treatments. Now, some of those causes are supernatural by our standards, ghosts, gods. But here's what that framework was actually doing. When you tell someone their suffering is caused by a spirit, you are giving them something modern psychiatry sometimes struggles to provide. You are giving them a story, an explanation, a reason why, and you are giving them a path forward. That's not nothing. That's a great deal of what makes therapy work. Ancient Egypt gets less credit than it deserves. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BC, describes what we would now recognize as clinical depression, framing it as a disease of the heart. Their treatments included talking, herbal medicine, and something called incubation therapy. A patient would sleep in a temple, surrounded by priests, and the dreams that came were analyzed as messages about the source of the suffering. You could argue, with a straight face, that this is the world's first sleep therapy and dream analysis. Freud did not invent that idea. The ancient Egyptians were there first, by about 3,000 years. Greece is where it gets genuinely radical, because Hippocrates, yes, the guy you swear an oath to if you become a doctor, looked at mental illness and said, "This isn't caused by gods or demons. It is caused by the brain, specifically by imbalances in 4 bodily fluids he called humors: too much black bile, melancholia, what we now call depression; too much yellow bile, mania." The theory was wrong in its specifics, but the framework, the idea that psychological suffering has a physiological cause, that the mind and body are connected, that mental illness is a medical problem and not a moral or spiritual failure, That framework would not be seriously challenged in Western medicine for 2,000 years, and then it would be catastrophically abandoned for about 500 years. Here's the part of this story that doesn't get enough attention. The Middle Ages did not invent the idea that mental illness was demonic possession. What the Middle Ages added was organized persecution. The Malleus Maleficarum, literally the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, provided a systematic framework for identifying, prosecuting, and executing people whose behavior was spiritually deviant. Historians have argued for decades about how many of the estimated 40,000 to 100,000 people executed for witchcraft in Europe were actually experiencing epilepsy, schizophrenia, psychosis, or severe depression. We don't know exactly, but the behavioral descriptions in witch trial transcripts, the visions, the voices, the inability to control one's body, the extreme psychological states, are unmistakable to anyone with a modern diagnostic vocabulary. People were burned alive for having schizophrenia. That is not history that happened to someone else. That is a fact about what organized societies do to people whose minds work differently when there is no medical framework to protect them. While this was happening in Europe, something else was happening in the Islamic world that history almost completely ignores. By the 9th century AD, Islamic physicians in Baghdad and Cairo had established what we would now call psychiatric hospitals, Bimaristans, institutions specifically dedicated to the care and treatment of the mentally ill. They used music therapy, occupational therapy, individual patient rooms, structured daily routines. The Bimaristan of Cairo, founded in 1284, was by any reasonable standard more humane and more medically sophisticated than anything that would exist in Europe for the next 500 years. History forgot this. History mostly forgot this on purpose. Which brings us to 1952, the year the American Psychiatric Association published the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. DSM-1 contained 106 diagnoses. By 2013, DSM-5 contained 541. Now, you could interpret that expansion as science making progress, and some of that is genuinely true, but there is another way to read those numbers. The expansion of the DSM happened in almost perfect parallel with the growth of the pharmaceutical industry. In 1980, DSM-3 introduced the category of major depressive disorder. Within a decade, antidepressants were among the most prescribed medications in the world. Pharmaceutical companies don't create diseases, but they do have a documented, legally established, historically proven track record of funding research that finds diseases their existing compounds happen to treat. There is a word for turning ordinary human suffering, grief, loneliness, the existential weight of being alive in a difficult world, into a clinical diagnosis requiring pharmaceutical intervention. That word is pathologization. And the Mesopotamian priest who sat with a suffering man and gave him a story, a community, and a ritual might have something to say about it. Here is what bothers me most about this entire history. The treatments that ancient cultures used for mental illness, the ones we dismissed as primitive and superstitious, were often hitting on something real. Community care. The strongest predictor of psychological resilience in modern research is social connection, not medication, not CBT, social connection, ritual and meaning-making. Narrative therapy, one of the most evidence-based psychological interventions in existence, is fundamentally about giving people a story that makes sense of their suffering. Physical activity. We now have clinical trials showing that running is as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression, sleep and restoration. We have an entire field of sleep medicine now confirming what ancient incubation therapy was reaching toward. They didn't have the neuroscience. They had the results, and sometimes the results were enough. So when did humans first go crazy? The honest answer is, we don't know. Because the first human who experienced what we'd now call a depressive episode left no record. What the record shows is that by the time any civilization was organized enough to write things down, mental illness was already there, already named, already being treated, already a problem that communities had developed responses to. The Mesopotamian priest and the modern psychiatrist are separated by 4,000 years of history, pharmacology, neuroscience, and institutional development. But they were asking the same question. What is wrong with this person's mind? How do we bring them back? The question hasn't changed. We've just gotten better at pretending we know the answer. Maybe what the ancient world understood, and we've partially forgotten, is that some questions don't have answers. They have practices, communities, rituals, people who show up. The mind has been breaking since minds existed, and what has always mattered most isn't the diagnosis. It's who's in the room when it happens.